So, look, this is a presentation about datasets, and really there's two tenets to this presentation. The first one is there's lots and lots of data out there, like more data than you can ever consume or do anything with. And my proposition to you is actually there's only 5 things you really need to care about. There's 5 sort of foundational data sets, and we'll talk about them more, but those are the ones you've got to care about. And the reason you've got to care about them is because the availability of that information and the integration of that information basically predetermine how far up the maintenance maturity curve you can go. And so that's sort of the second proposition. We'll cover that in more detail as we go through. Okay. And I want to emphasize, one, I like challenge, so please ask me questions. I really enjoy that. A big part of doing stuff like this is to sharpen my sort of understanding. And it's a big statement because basically what I'm saying is you can have the right structure, you can have the right documentation, you can have the right people, you can have all these things. It doesn't matter. The first step is the information. If the information isn't there, it doesn't matter. And yeah, that's an important premise of this. So before we jump into the data sets, I wanted to cover the idea of maintenance maturity. And I wanted to cover it a little bit differently. So you guys have probably seen a slide like this before, which is basically just, sorry, I think there's another mic here, which is basically just breaking out the different sort of stages of maintenance maturity. And normally what you would see here is, oh, you're in a reactive maintenance and your costs are really high and your downtime's really high and whatever. And then as you move further down, your costs are great and your production is great, cool. And that's still true. What I've tried to do here is I've tried to look under the hood a bit. So those are the outcomes. So cost reductions, better availability, that's the outcomes. How do you get there? Well, I would propose to you that the mechanism by which we get there is first, the information is available. Then, because that information is available, we're able to do some kind of mathematics. Then, because we're able to do those calculations, we're able to put in a process or system in place, and then that process or system is the thing that gives you the outcome, right? And just to put that in sort of more practical terms, so I've got this heading here called diagnostic maintenance. And basically what I'm saying here, you've got enterprise systems in place. We'll cover what those are, but let's say SAP. And that means you've got those things into place, you're able to measure things like availability, you're able to measure service levels. If you can measure service levels, you can do continuous improvement. You can do things like defect elimination. Basically, you can do things that are deterministic, which basically, 1 + 1 = 2. So just straight maths. Now, as you get more information, and crucially, as you're able to integrate the information, you're able to do different kind of maths. So in this next step, you're able to do probabilistic calculations. And because you're able to do probabilistic calculations, you can make a risk-based preventative maintenance program. And the next stage after that is you're able to do optimization calculations. So what's the difference there? Well, optimization requires on a multiple different kind of functions. So it requires this stuff from before to be able to do an optimization. You can't do an optimization without having good source of truth and stuff, right? And once you have that, then you can have optimized budgets and optimized capital profiles and everything. So that's when I say maintenance maturity and that the maturity of these data sets basically determines maintenance maturity, that's what I mean, is they make this stuff possible. The other point is it's not just this, right? The structures, the people, the documents are still important, but this is, in my view, step 1. You can't, if you don't do this, there's a big strategic error. All right. So I spoke a lot about 5 foundational data sets. What are the 5 foundational data sets? So I'm just going to go through them. If you've heard of these before, I'm sorry, but You've got to listen to me. The first one is the fixed asset register. You guys might know it as the FAR, F-A-R, and that's where all of the capital transactions are stored. That's where things like life cycle information is stored. And in many ways, that's the thing that sets the scope of what maintenance is responsible for. Right? Number two, the financial ledger. That's where all the costs are recorded, transactions are recorded. But as with all of these data sets, they record the transaction, but they also record important attributes. So what kind of cost was it? Was it a material cost? Was it a labor cost? Et cetera, et cetera. And they tell you something about where that cost was incurred. So within the portfolio. Similarly, delay accounting system. Instead of being financial transactions, we've got delay event transactions. So downtime measured, the duration of that event measured. And again, similar to a financial transaction, where it occurred and attributes along with it. And then I've got a fancy word here called a CMMS, but really what I mean is SAP and IBM Maximo, which is typically used by a lot of asset-intensive industries. And that's where the work orders are recorded, right? That's the transaction there. I want you to remember that word transaction. And that's really, really important because that tells you if something was done preventatively or reactively. You're getting the pattern here. They're all important. And then finally, there's a HR system. That tells us who's doing the maintenance, what kind of experience level do they have, what kind of capability, what kind of certification do they have, right? So that's the 5 foundational data sets. You get those right, and your maintenance journey is much, much simpler. I have some really good news. Because these data sets have some kind of core business function, they're going to be available in your company. Someone will have them. And they're going to be there because they're doing some kind of really important function. So for example, the fixed asset register and the financial ledger, well, that's where a lot of companies' financial statements are produced from. There's also where they do a lot of financial control, so someone can't just send their own account like money every month. The delay accounting system, that's how we manage production, how a company often produces information about like downtime, availabilities, etc. Work orders, if you've got 10,000 people working, then you need a way of distributing that work, getting people the jobs they need to do, recording what happened, etc. It's happening. HR system, well, you got to do payroll, right? There's all kinds of compliance on a company as well. So all of these things exist. Hooray. Now, I gave you the good news. The bad news is they exist, but they're like spread everywhere. So different teams own them, and different teams have their own thing that they're worried about, right? If you're in asset accounting, you want to make sure your financial statement is correct. Right? If you're in, what have I got there? Finance, you're interested in different things. They have a core business function other than asset management, other than maintenance. That's problem number one. Problem number two is they've all developed in their own way. So no one has tethered them together to be like, an equipment in this system is equivalent to this system, or this collection of things is called the same thing. There's no tethering. They've evolved independently, and they didn't just start like last year. They've been around for decades, right? So you've got these systems. So it's good news. They're probably available in your organization. The bad news, they're everywhere. They're doing their own thing. All right. Okay, now, so that leads to problems, but we'll get into those problems later. But the mere existence of those data sets is really helpful, because if they exist, then really the company is able to get to sort of at least the diagnostic maintenance level, because the information exists. It's an important caveat. So one, the information can exist, but it also has to be accessible. the information can exist and be accessible, but it might not be at the right granularity. So it might not be at the equipment level. So we have to make sure that those things are fulfilled. Then you can tick this one off, and you can, a lot of my thinking around this is, in my last job, I was sort of doing a project around uplifting the maintenance management system, and this is the problems I kept on running into. And it's basically, if you're trying to uplift the maintenance system of your organization, I'm basically giving you a green light. You're going to be able to get to this level given that these datasets exist. But this is good, right? It means you can write something like an asset management plan. You can do portfolio analysis, you can look at your historical financials, you can do lots of stuff. But there's lots of stuff you can't do. And the reason you can't do them is because it's really difficult to join. And I'm sure many people in this room have had the pleasure of trying to put two of these foundational data sets together. It's tricky, to say the least. And I'm going to dig into why it's tricky and why it's important that joins can occur. Because if the joins can occur, then that's when we can do the predictive maintenance. That's when we can do the adaptive stuff. So that's the real next level of maturity. Okay. Now, I mentioned that all of these, on the left-hand side, all of these foundational data sets, which I'm sure you're very familiar with now, they're all owned by different people. Well, that's kind of a big deal, and we're going to see why. But before we get into that, I also want to point out this idea of transactions. Within these data sets, the transaction is the lowest level of measurement in there. So, for example, in the financial fixed asset register, when I say a capital transaction, it could be an instance of like a depreciation. In a ledger, it's paying a PO. It's physical things, but the transaction is the lowest level of that thing. For most purposes, that really super duper low level is not useful. You need to aggregate it together to make it useful, right? Because you're not going to look at 500 machines one by one. You want to look at, okay, these machines which are kind of in this process plant, and that's basically describing the idea of a hierarchy. And the problem here is that the hierarchies, because they're all these systems are all designed for different core purposes, the hierarchies diverge. So let's have a look. We start off with the super duper high level, which is like the total company. Everything's all good. Then the company divides into its operations. It's still all good. Maybe it's time to break out the champagne. It's not so bad. Uh-oh. We start seeing some deviations. In this case, the deviations are happening because from a financial and a HR perspective, it makes more sense to divide the organisation down operation and then accountability. So maintenance, production, some other accountability. Whereas in the other ones, it makes more sense to break it down in terms of the equipment hierarchies. So you get to the operation, you get to a processing area, and so on and so forth. But you can see how there's a natural divergence. And no one is incorrect. Those are both legitimate ways to break it down. Okay. I considered putting emojis down the bottom instead of the green dots and the orange dots. This is where there would be a concerned face. And then this is going to be the worried face. So in this case, now the deviations are getting worse. So as you step down the hierarchy, the problems escalate. The information is exponential and the problems is exponential. So what's happening here? Well, the fixed asset register has decided to create its own thing called a subclass, which is different to whatever is going on here. The HR system is going to do something completely different. The superintendent, which is just responsible for electricians, right? The financial ledger, it's doing its own thing. Okay. And then there's pure chaos. The final level, that would be like a disgusted face or an angry face. I don't know. But basically you get to this level and nothing aligns. It's totally incompatible. And now, because it's incompatible, that inhibits the analysis, right? And that's the underlying sort of mode. We were talking about you need the information, then you can do the maths, then you can get the process in, then you can get the outcome. So because of this, now you can't do calculations at that grain. And that's the grain that they need to be done at, right? You can't do a preventative maintenance strategy for a process unit or a collection of equipment. You need to do it for that particular pump. All right, now what does that mean? We can't do the calculations, can't calculate risk, can't do an optimization, maturity, capped out, right? What do we do? Well, I'm not all doom and gloom. Like pretty much everything I've said thus far is pretty doom and gloom. But the business can do something about it. But the business has to actively try and resolve this. So an example that's very common is like work order settlement. So for those of you who are not familiar, a work order settlement is basically where a certain amount of cost is assigned to a work order, and then that work order settles against a cost center. And what's happening here is you're basically taking the financial ledger and breaking it down one step further to the work order level. And now those two hierarchies align. Hooray. Right? Yeah, you can do something similar. The big problem here between a measuring point and a functional location is roughly the same thing, but they just don't agree. They call things differently. You need a mapping. You can put in a mapping. It takes time and effort, but the business can actively fix problems like this. Now, you do that, and voila. We haven't solved every problem. The fixed asset register is still doing the same things. The HR system is still doing its own thing, but there is enough progress there that you can do a bit of prediction, you can do a bit of optimization. So yeah, that's kind of the key concept. So we talked about the idea of data availability. Is the information available? This was the second concept about data integration. Can it be integrated? Right? They're naturally not integrated. The business has to actively integrate them. Now, again, that leads us to some logical conclusions. Sorry, I've made some really good notes that I want to reference here, so please be patient. So, given those two things, I propose to you there's some logical conclusions that come out of this. One, when we think of like an asset management plan or asset management policy or a strategic asset management plan, I haven't read many where there were specific things about these are the data pipelines that are going to be in there. And we've got to think about like the data pipeline as almost like a piece of equipment, like a literal physical piece of equipment. And so in that sense, if you're going down an asset management journey, you've got to think about this information, and it's only 5 pipelines, right? You can do a lot of stuff with those. There's other data sets around, but those 5, you should cover them. And that should be part of your asset management journey. 2, we know that maintenance doesn't own those things, right? BHP, for example, is a very centralized organization, but we definitely don't own those 5 data sets. And I would say most organizations are like that. So you have to engage with those stakeholders. And it's in everybody's interest that this uplift happens. So in many cases, if the engagement's good, the engagement's early. If the engagement doesn't compromise the core business of that data set, you find a lot of support. And then finally, we talked about, say, work order settlement, mappings. If you identified that big piece of work early, man, that's going to make your life easier. And then finally, really what I've said here to you is, hey, to do asset management, there's this big strategic overhang of digital infrastructure you've got to look after and build and sort of maintain. Well, you can set it up once, but how are you going to sustain it? And I guess one of indirect things I'm saying is a large maintenance department will probably need some kind of analytics function to do data engineering, to have the SME knowledge to be able to do this work. I think that's one of the logical implications. And then finally, you can't solve this stuff in like a year. This is like 5 years, you know, that kind of timeline. It's something that's really like planning horizon kind of stuff. And then finally, the other thing I wanted to just show is, if you want to know where your organisation is on that continuum, then I've made a little bit of a checklist. You can go through that. It's not super complicated, and you can sort of figure out what's, you know, where your organisation's maintenance maturity caps out from information, from the information perspective. That's really it for me. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your report. Questions, please. Got a bit of time? Questions? I'll start off. Data quality.
Yeah.
How do you and your team manage data quality from the various sites, and how big of a risk is it to your end of this?
Pretty big risk. I think it's going to sound very Machiavellian, but if you have the best data quality, then everybody trusts you. And so there's a natural incentive there. But so for us, you know, I would say we have 2 or 3 people that don't just do data quality things, but they set up the systems that ensure the data quality. Just as an example, we do sort of like this financial settlement process every year. Not every year, every month. And all of BHP's assets do slightly different asset accounting and slightly different reporting. They're the owners of their truth. And so we have this monthly process that basically makes sure that that didn't go awry, all of our mappings are still up to date, everything still works. We have a similar process for like delay accounting. So we've got to make sure that the equipment that we're counting, the equipment is still active, what's been decommissioned, blah, 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 right? You've got to have these processes in place. I would say it's a big risk because if your data is shit, sorry, I shouldn't swear. If your data is no good, then you lose your sort of authority as a single source of truth. But it's also a big opportunity because if you're the single source of truth, everyone's dependent on you and you have the resources to produce that information.
Other questions? Yeah, back there.
Say your team wants to pull together these 5 data sets and integrate them all, create all your mappings and everything, so you can solve your own problems. How do you find the balance between that just creating a further silo, a data silo within the business, versus a business-wide solution?
If someone in my team said, I'm going to go create these pipelines in isolation, I'd be like, you're mad. It's too big a job for one team. You're right about the idea of silos, and that's why, you know, unless the organisation is structured where all of the ownership is on one party, then maybe it's possible. But like for me, even the premise of trying to do it all as one party is not possible. But if it were possible, how do you ensure that there's no silos? Well, you got to have processes and stuff in place that make sure that the consumers of the information can get it. They'll naturally give you feedback if your numbers are wrong or if they don't get what they want. And so there's sort of like a continuous improvement or a continuously updating sort of cycle that way. In my experience, that's kind of what we do, is over time, I would say in maintenance, we've sort of built like a very reliable set of data pipelines, and then lots of people become dependent on that. And then, you know, we might decide to make improvements or things based on the business need. That's how we try and prevent the silos. Yeah. Yes?
I just wonder, so in your organization, who is the owner to responsible for the data quality? Because this cause different functions, so not all the...
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And I'm going to talk about here the idea of a data pipeline, right? You get the data from somewhere raw, you do some transformations, you get a metric, etc. Now, when we have a data pipeline, not one person owns the data pipeline. Different people own different bits of the data pipeline. And different people are therefore responsible for different bits of the data quality. And more than anything else, that accountability needs to be clear. Because if we're getting source, raw, bad information, then we can apply the pressure and get that fixed up. If the data quality issues is within our remit, we can definitely do something about it. But then I have an incentive to create a test, to not have it's literally like reliability engineering. Is there a defect elimination process? Yeah, I think if you have a problem with data quality, I think it'll be more issue of accountability. And one thing people do incorrectly is they try to give the accountability of an entire data pipeline to one party. Impossible, right? Data pipelines will need to be subdivided into accountabilities. And once those accountabilities are clear, people do their own defect elimination and you get a reliable quality data over time.
Further questions? Thank you very much. Appreciate that.